Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to BEREC Technical Workshop on IPv6 deployment across Europe. I would like to express our gratitude to our moderator, Mr. Bonis, and all the outstanding experts giving a presentation and participating in the panel discussion today. I'm Klaus Nieminen, a co-chair of the BEREC Open Internet Working Group and the chair of National IPv6 Task Force, which organized the Finnish IPv6 launch in 2015. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next one. Yeah. Before diving into the topic, please let me briefly present BEREC, the body of European regulators for electronic communications. BEREC contributes to the development and better functioning of the internal market for the electronic communication networks and services. It does so by aiming to ensure a consistent application of EU regulatory framework and by aiming to promote an efficient internal market in the telecom sector in order to bring even greater benefits to consumers and businesses alike. What's BEREC's role in the domain of IPv6? Next slide. BEREC has no formal mandate in the field of IPv6. Next slide. But even if BEREC has no mandate in this domain, next slide, it matters to have a look at BEREC's strategic priorities, which are promoting full connectivity, driving for sustainable and open digital markets, and empowering end users. In this slide, it is clearly desirable for BEREC to place an emphasis on IPv6 adoption across Europe, motivated by the following factors. A sufficient number of public IP addresses are needed so that end users can use and provide services, and that the internet can scale and continues to function as the engine of innovation, both of which are relevant in the context of open internet regulation. The RIPE NCC has run out of IPv4 addresses already in 2019. Well, some organizations still have free addresses. Some of them can also sell addresses to the others. But both buying addresses and deploying carrier-grade NATs have a price tag. And IPv4 just don't scale much further to support the growth of the internet. The success of the internet, the diversity of new uses, and the predicted growth of Internet of Things have a direct consequence to the growing exhaustion of IPv4 addresses. Therefore, as far as we understand it, the transition to IPv6 is necessary. Within BEREC, we are following the developments regarding IPv6 matters. Next slide, please. This chart illustrates the situation across BEREC members and participating states as mid-May 21. More precisely, the chart takes into consideration the media value of different third-party sources that are Google, Facebook, Akamai, and Apnic. We can observe that some BEREC members and participants are performing well above the global average when it comes to the IPv6 deployment, but most BEREC Plus countries are lagging behind. Based on the statistics, 3/4 of EU 27 population does not have access to IPv6. There are big differences between member states in IPv6 deployment, as we can see from this chart. In some countries, the transition has not even started. The deployment of IPv6 seems to remain as a national affair, in a sense that different circumstances drive IPv6 adoption in different countries. Furthermore, there are differences with regards to the competencies in the transition to IPv6 and actions taken at national level. For instance, in some countries, the responsibility in this matter lies with a public authority, while in the others, it is up to the industry or it is subject to self-regulation. However, it is possible that two countries with totally different institutional settings regarding the responsibility have a similar IPv6 adoption rate. NRAs active in this area have taken actions based on their general mandate and the objectives to promote connectivity and availability and general quality of Internet access services. Now I would like to introduce you our moderator, Mr. Bonis, who is the CEO of AFNIC and the chair of CCNSO's Internet Governance Committee in ICANN. Please, Mr. Bonis, the floor is yours. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Hello, everyone. Very, very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this great panel. So first of all, I'm Pierre Bonis, CEO of AFNIC. AFNIC is the registry for the .fr. And I think this is my first participation to BEREC event, so I'm very, very pleased, and I would just like to thank, of course, the BEREC and our regulatory telecom regulatory body in France, ARCEP, for the opportunity to be here today. I think IPv6, I can say that IPv6 is a concern for most of the internet registry in the world, so it makes sense that we are here through AFNIC, because the internet registries are registries, just like local internet registries, and sometimes they are also local internet registries, which means that they have a business in using IP addresses. I'm not going to be too long about that, but that's a long time concern for AFNIC to make sure that IPv6 deployment is running well, especially in France. We have worked with ARCEP since almost 10 years on observatories about the IPv6 deployment, and we have been in the position to try to help sometimes the public policy makers to identify means of accelerating the IPv6 deployment in France. So I'm particularly interested by what the panel is going to say to us. But this is once again a great panel, and thank you and congratulations to BEREC to have put together this amount of expertise.
This meeting is being recorded.
And to have illustrated the multi-stakeholder nature of the internet through the multi-stakeholder composition of this panel. Well, you will have the opportunity to listen to organizations, people coming from organizations such as technical organizations, private business, organizations that represent the industry, major companies, government officials, and technical community and civil society. So I think this is very complete. I'm going to give the floor to the first participant. Just before, let me remind you that you are all welcome to participate. This is not just connect and listen. This is an interactive session, we hope. And you will see that on the right side of the VBRIC screen, you will see a question mark icon, and you can click the button to take the opportunity to ask a question or provide a comment. That will be very important, especially during the second part of this session, because half of the session will be presentation from the panelists, and the other half will be as much interactive as it is possible in a dialogue between all of you and the panelists. So without taking too much time, I will like to give the floor first to our representative from RIPE NCC, Marco Ogewoning, Manager of Public Policy and Internet Governance at RIPE NCC. Marco is, as the Manager of the Public Policy and Internet Governance, has a task to help policymakers. I think this is great that it starts with the presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of policymakers in the room, so you will have a specialist of IPv6, but also a specialist of how to help policymakers. And I think this is a great gift given to us all by BEREC. So, Marco, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It's Marco Ogewoning. I work for the RIPE NCC. If I can have the next slide, please. I've been asked to give you a brief introduction of why we are here. Some of this might seem familiar to you. If so, please bear with us. But I'm really trying to bring everybody up to speed with what happened so far and what happened so far in the last 25 years. So to remind each other again, what is the problem that we're facing here? Well, the problem is that an IPv4 address and the internet as we know it, and people speak about the internet protocol, they usually still refer to IP version 4, has 32 bits in its address field, and that's a fixed length. Now 2 to the power of 32 gives you 4.2 billion unique addresses. And with the notion that within a network, each device that connects needs a unique address, you can see that on a global network, such as the internet, you can only connect 4.2 billion addresses. That doesn't come as a surprise. In fact, this was really early on already recognized when the internet really took off, and you're looking at sort of the late 80s, 1990, about people thought like, hey, but if we build a global network and we only have 4 billion addresses, this isn't gonna fit. So they started thinking. If we can have the next slide, please. Talking about solutions. And initially and in the short term, people thought like, okay, we need something different. We need to work on this. And in order to buy us some time to figure out a permanent solution, people figured out like, okay, what if we abandon the classful system? Up until then, it was a very rigid model, and a lot of people got way more addresses than they actually needed. So people introduced something called variable subnetting, and that reduced it sort of the waste. It cut down on the overhead and the space that people didn't need. Also, at the same time, people thought about a needs-based allocation, and that became the fundamental system behind the RER system, where you no longer just get addresses, you actually explain why you need addresses and how many addresses you need, and you get an appropriate size allocation. Secondly, or thirdly to that, the technical people figured out a way to translate addresses. That was already existing technology, but more importantly, they figured out a way that you can translate from non-unique addresses that are only unique in your network, private address space as we now commonly know it, to a small portion of public IPv4 space. And that was a really nifty trick, and it actually worked. And in fact, today we still use that. Pretty much every Wi-Fi device, every Wi-Fi network you connect to will use this trick and allow you to have multiple devices in a network, while on the outside it will only consume one public IP space. That allowed us to buy time, that allowed us to figure out a more permanent solution. And that more permanent solution first was known as IPNG, the next generation internet protocol. Develop and standardize your replacement and make sure that the new protocol scales up to what we think is needed. And then have enough time for the industry to adapt, deploy this protocol in time for the runout. And as Klaus already said in his introduction, that runout eventually happened back in 2019. So we still have a bit of time left. Can I have the next slide, please? IPv6 then, that became the replacement. That was the first version available. And that next generation protocol uses as its main feature 128-bit addresses. Now 2 to the power of 128 is a ginormous number. It has 39 digits. Well into the future, this will scale up. We've got enough addresses to come by. At the same time, people introduced some other features that at the time were seen as optimizations. More rigid structure, it allowed for extension headers. And people at the time thought, this makes it slightly faster, makes it easier to handle in our routers and switches. Some of these features got abandoned. In other areas, technology has caught up so much that was once seen as an optimization no longer counts as one. Importantly, and that's the beauty of the internet design, it was also designed to be a drop-in replacement for IPv4. So the transport layer, everything else you do on the internet can remain in place unaltered. You can really just take IPv4 out, put IPv6 in, and everything keeps working. Can I have the next slide, please? With that, the real challenge became timing. We had a new protocol, it was ready to go, but how to deploy it? And at that stage, the internet was already too big to say, okay, if we just all switch over at once, we're done. So it was specifically designed to coexist. You can deploy IPv6 alongside of IPv4. And the thinking there was that if you do that, and if you prefer IPv6, then if I speak IPv6 and you speak IPv6, we'll use IPv6. And the more people deploy IPv6, slowly IPv4 will no longer be used and gradually fade out. And that's still the basic idea behind the whole IPv6 transition. This is not an instant replacement. It's not about switching off IPv4. It's building the capability to use IPv6. At the same time, then the question becomes, who goes first? Because I can deploy IPv6, but I can only use it if the other one also deploys IPv6. So the benefit only becomes visible once your peer, the other party, deploys IPv6. Thank you. Can I have the next slide? And that timing really became a problem. Next slide, please, Jonathan. Because at the time IPv6 was ready for deployment, we're looking at 1995, 1996, and the internet was really booming. And nobody really had time to wait for some what they thought was unproven technology. And the problem of running out of addresses was something of a distant future, and we wanted the internet now. And nobody felt the shortage. There were plenty of IPv4 address space still available in the registries, so everybody just ran with that. At the same time, we saw internet also move more towards a client-server model. And that kind of emphasized that timing problem, the chicken and egg problem that I just described of who goes first. Because with the separation into access networks and content networks, the clients and the servers, it really becomes a matter of why would you deploy IPv6 in an access network if there is no content? But why would you put content on IPv6 if there is no support in the access networks and users can't access that content on IPv6? So you kind of developed into a first mover disadvantage. You have to trust the others to also deploy IPv6, because if they don't, your own investment in IPv6 becomes a rather worthless exercise. Moving on. Next slide, please. So where we are right now, and that was emphasized already by Klaus and Pierre, yes, the RER system has run out of available IPv4 space. We sometimes get small portions returned. There is a waiting list for that. And we have a very lively secondary market. People are trading unused IPv4 space. That works to some extent, but it is expensive. The market prices we hear, we're not involved in the financial transaction bit, but you quickly hear people quote prices of $25, $30 for a single IPv4 space. That's pretty common price for such thing. Also, it's actually not all doom and gloom. As you saw early in Klaus' slide, there is quite a lot of IPv6 in use, but it's a very scattered landscape. Different markets, different positions, and interestingly, while rich countries usually go ahead a bit, that's not always the case. There are developing countries that pretty much run circles around wealthy nations when it comes to IPv6 deployment. India is a nice example, but for instance also Peru. We also, and that's think more European view, but tend to be that fixed lines are ahead of mobile deployments, but again, not in every market. We see massive mobile deployments in India and in the US, but also across Europe, more and more mobile networks deploy IPv6. But there is no unified thing that says, oh, this is fully IPv6. It's always this patchwork, even at the national level. Can I have the next slide, please? So, looking at that signal.
And that will be the conclusion if you.
Sorry, Pierre. Okay, then, yeah. Rounding up, there's a few more slides. I hope we can make them available later on then. But this is no longer a technical problem. But what we're looking at here is that IPv6 from a technology perspective works. And you can even argue it's not an immediate economical problem as well. IPv6 deployment will cost money, but so do the alternatives. And we do see developing nations outperform developed ones, so GDP isn't a key decisive factor. Rounding up then, apologies for taking a bit longer. You're very much entering a commercial phase here. This is a commercial challenge because people don't see the obvious benefit of IPv6. This is not something you can sell to a customer. And with that, I think we can also not underestimate that this might be a political problem. What we're looking at here, and that was the question originally asked, what's the cost of doing IPv6, is something that has a really long horizon. We're looking at future generations, we're looking at developing nations, and I think that's an important one that we need to think about when we look at what are the drivers behind deploying IPv6. This is not so much for you and me. We here right now, we have a working internet, it probably still uses IPv4. But what we really need to think about, what is the world we want to see 10, 15 years from now? And with that, also IoT. Apologies for taking a bit longer. As I said, there's a bit more slides here. I hope we can make them available. And of course, we can talk about that later during the wrap up. Thank you, Pierre. I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Marco. And thank you very much for this introduction. We will have the time to come back during the second part and interact with all the participants. Thank you to have introduced the commercial challenge and the evolution versus revolution approach of transition from IPv4 to IPv6. And now this is the time to have the point of view of operators on that very, very important topic. And I will give the floor to Marit Palovirta, Director of Regulatory Affairs at ETNO. I think everyone knows ETNO here. And thank you, Marit, to be in this panel. I just want to say that I highlighted the multi-stakeholder nature of this panel. And what is great with you is that you are multi-stakeholder on your own because you came from ISOC and now you're at ETNO. So thank you very much for that. And I give you the floor for your presentation, IPv6 deployment, an ISP perspective. 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pierre, and a pleasure to be here. Big thank you to BEREC as well for having invited us, and indeed for let's say revisiting this important topic that has somehow been a bit in the policy shadows at the EU level in the last couple of years. Although of course progress has been made in terms of deployment throughout all this time. So as Pierre said, so I represent ETNO now, and in fact this presentation I'm doing this on behalf of ETNO, so the European Telecommunication Operators, but also on behalf of GSMA, so the Global Mobile Operators Association. And I think GSMA colleagues are present here today, so you will also be able to directly address them in the questions part if of interest. And next slide, please. So I'll just give a bit of an update from the ISP point of view on the current state of play, the deployment, and also then perhaps touch on some of the hurdles that still seem to be there. Klaus shared some interesting numbers. They are improving, of course, all the time, but perhaps not as quickly as some might hope. And finally, then also we'll share some ideas for going forward on what we think that would be useful to advance this process even further. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So we already heard from Klaus and Marco that this is indeed not a new story. And of course, this is IPv6 is not a new story from the operator point of view either. So we are very aware that IPv4 addresses have been depleting for many years now. And also of the fact that there are serious impacts both for operators, but also for the digital ecosystem at large, if we don't deploy IPv6 in a timely manner. And of course, the impossibility to assign IPv4 addresses to clients from an operator point of view introduces a risk to business continuity, because this is very much part of the core business of operators. Then if we are projecting a bit into the future, IPv6 is also a catalyst for emerging services. And we are now very much in the process of deploying 5G around Europe. And 5G, of course, enables a whole new variety of services based on Internet of Things, things like intelligence, transport services, etc. And these services simply cannot be delivered without IPv6. So we fully recognize that IPv6 is relevant for the current business, but also very much when we look to develop new services going forward with 5G. Now, having said that, IPv as adoption from our perspective is and should be considered more of a long-term project than something that would really happen overnight. And you can imagine that, well, ETNO GSMA members, operators tend to be the largest operators in Europe. So the organization sizes are massive. And also, if you go back a bit, so these are companies, of course, that have been in existence for decades, some even for 100 years. So the amount of digital infrastructure, technical infrastructure, layers of different types of systems, information systems, applications, etc., that exist in the companies, including data centers, etc., it's very complex technically. So the deployment of IPv6 is something that needs to be, of course, very carefully planned, and also then this will take some time. And this also then includes the costs consideration. I think Marco briefly in the end mentioned that. So to make sure that once we are migrating new things, other things, that IPv6 will then become part of the new systems automatically. But the key message here is that non-deployment, of course, can lead to critical issues, especially then when we now start seeing IPv6 becoming more massively adopted and deployed across Europe. Next slide, please. So in terms of the current state of deployment, most large operators have published their IPv6 deployment strategies already in the early 2000s and increasingly, well, in the last 10 years or so. And large majority of European ISPs have adopted IPv6 in dual stack. And as Marco was explaining, that they can be running parallel with IPv4, So this is something that is currently done by most of the larger European operators. We just added here a link to Akamai as a kind of a nice statistics source to get some current percentages on the state of deployment also from the operator's side. And if you look at then the numbers, indeed these percentages, whether it comes from Akamai or we look at Klaus's numbers that Klaus presented in the beginning, it is very clear that hurdles certainly still remain somewhere because we are not perhaps advancing as fast across the board as one might have thought. And there is still, we believe, a lack of kind of convincing incentives to some players. So I tried to already explain that from our perspective, there is already an incentive and we see the business relevance very clearly. But to some players, there is perhaps lack of incentive. It could be a lack of education. It could be other things. But then also the complexity at technical level might be a bit of a fear factor, if you like, to some players in this respect. So those are just a couple of things that, in terms of hurdles that we have observed in the ecosystem. Next slide, please. And then, so if we look at the future and think about the things going forward with IPv6, our main message is very clearly that IPv6 is not a constraint and should not be considered as such, but it's really a great business development opportunity. And this is especially for operators, of course, in the context of 5G, as I already explained. And this is not anymore even something that is in the very kind of mid to long term. This is immediate development, and the services are being, of course, deployed and developed as we speak. So we will have more connected devices, and this will then require also more addresses, which in practice will mean IPv6 in most cases. Next slide, please. And then looking a bit more kind of holistically on how we can foster on IPv6 deployment. So standards are still key, and of course IPv6 came from the standardization community already decades ago, but this is still something that is a key factor because not all technologies are ready yet for IPv6. And from operators' point of view, of course, we have the kind of core network structures that are perhaps fully managed ourselves. But then, as I was alluding to before, there are many other components in the networks that are not necessarily, let's say, part of the core infrastructure. Though this could be things like, I don't know, different types of applications, different types of equipment that are being used. And so we need to make sure that all of these different parts of the connectivity value chain and ecosystem are then supporting IPv6 and are IPv6 ready. And so how do we make this happen? Pierre, you already mentioned the key word of the multi-stakeholder cooperation. And I think that from our point of view, this is something perhaps where everybody can play some kind of role. And from operators' side, of course, as larger operators, I mean, many of our members are in a position to share good practices and are part of national level discussions in many countries. There have been good experiences in some countries where, for example, government or regulator has initiated some kind of voluntary task force or this type of arrangement whereby all key stakeholders can exchange good practices, discuss hurdles, etc., and even come up with common plans on how to go forward. So these types of things can then also serve, I believe, to advance the education and make sure that also perhaps smaller players or players who are not yet aware can be part of this effort. On a policy level, and I think this was part of the discussion here in the workshop. So there are some useful soft policy measures also that can be used, and governments again, can be a kind of anchor, like in many ways, and set the example. So IPv6 can be included and should be included in all kinds of digital projects as a kind of prerequisite, if you like. So whether it's through procurement, through other things, etc., this is a kind of indirect way by which we can promote IPv6 deployment going forward. And I think ultimately what we are looking here for Europe is that we should have a kind of interoperable connectivity environment whereby we can then, all the different components can be working together and are compatible and using IPv6 going forward. So I will stop my initial remarks here, and I'm of course happy to answer to questions later on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Marit, for this point of view from the operators at Node, GSMA, and thank you for insisting on the cost of not transitioning. First of all, the lack of incentive, or the perceived lack of incentive, and the acknowledgement of the problem and the solutions that may arise. So thank you very much for that. And I will switch now to Paul Saab, a software engineer at Facebook. So if you don't know Facebook, I will explain you where they are coming from, etc. But we don't have the time, so I'm very sure that Paul will be able to explain you who is Facebook. Paul is an engineer at Facebook, and he's worked for almost 14 years there. So he has been heavily involved in FreeBSD, so in open source, and he will present us the challenges and lessons learned by CAPS with respect to IPv6 transition. So it's a presentation, and Paul will have maybe a deeper technical analysis of IPv6. So I give him the floor now for his presentation, 10 minutes. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us here today. I think, Facebook's journey with IPv6 was, it's slightly different than, in the operator world, but we have seen over the years that it has been instrumental in our ability to scale our networks and, our data centers and, transition basically all of our infrastructure over to IPv6. The story with V6 and my relationship with it was started, back in 2011 when the world decided we would launch V6 for one day, and back then we had almost no IPv6 inside of our infrastructure. We actually had one load balancer that was dual stacked, and the entire network was still IPv4. And on the successes of that, we officially launched dual stacked everywhere on our edge network in 2012 with the World V6 launch. And then since then, we saw the writing on the walls. So, next slide, as everybody has alluded to, we in the United States ran out of V4 around 2015, I believe it was. And, while we were still using private addressing, internally, our network engineers came to me and they were like, so we have this problem in about 24 to 36 months, we're going to run out of RFC 1918 space, which is, the private addressing internally. And, they came to me and they were like, what should we do? And, we looked at, multiple options, renumbering everything internally, even so far as to going out and say buying a /8 at that time, which would have been significantly cheaper than it is today. And we ultimately ended up, deciding that we would, migrate internally to IPv6. So, one of the things that people may not realize about Facebook is that the only V4 that exists in our network is on our edge network. We actually deploy everything internally V6 only. We talk to the internet through proxies. Internally, we actually deploy NAT6.4 in some scenarios, so that we don't actually have to deliver V4 connectivity internally. This has actually allowed us to grow on a global scale and basically never have to worry about addressing. But one of the other interesting things that came out with V6 was, I gave a talk in 2015 at one of Facebook's at scale conferences. And one of the things that we had noticed was V6 was appearing to be faster than V4 on mobile handsets in the United States. So much so that it was like about 20 to 40% faster on LTE devices with the major carriers. And, we wanted to share this information because we felt like there was a lack of deployment from the, applications out there on the internet. So, your apps on your phone, everybody was deploying, V4 only services. And it was our hope to share that, we were seeing these improvements and maybe other applications would deploy V6. Sadly, I don't believe, the growth of actual content on the, in the world has grown at the rate at which we have seen connectivity, grow. So, in the next slide, you can see that, Facebook has had steady growth. We only started publishing numbers a couple of years ago in terms of the amount of V6 traffic that we see today. But, in terms of global adoption, we see, almost a third of the world coming to Facebook over IPv6. But Europe is only about 15% of that. Next slide. And we show similar data. We break this out via country as well, but this is the one most people are familiar with. It shows, how the European landscape is very mishmashed. You have, countries that are excellent, and then other countries that, either are not or are extremely slow to deploy. Next slide. In the United States, whereas, the 31% of the world reaches Facebook over V6, 60% of the United States comes to Facebook over IPv6. And we used to, in the United States would like to be number one, but, India is actually number one. 67% of Indian internet users come to Facebook over V6. And this is mainly due to Reliance Jio, who came out of nowhere and launched a completely V6 only network. I think somewhere around 90+% of their traffic to Facebook reaches Facebook over V6. And this is in comparison to about 88 to 89% of the US mobile operators come to us over V6. So their single deployment trumps all of the US traffic in terms of, V6. Next slide. So one of the things that I was looking for after Facebook, after we finished most of our V6 work internally, which, wrapped up around the end of 2014. So, Facebook has been basically V6 only inside of our core since, basically the end of 2014. So, we're coming up on like 6.5 years of basically not really having to worry about internal addressing of V4. But I started looking at like connectivity in the developing world and how to improve that and how to build scalable networks. And I started looking around, and Facebook had started investing in this technology called terragraph, which is a big wireless mesh, but it's not like a wireless mesh like you have in your home where you use like Eero or Orbi or any of those other things. It's a point-to-point fixed wireless network that delivers gigabits of capacity over the air. And we were looking at how we would actually scale this. And we ended up deciding we would take the tricks that we had learned inside of the data center and deploy those in this urban mesh. So next slide, please. And so like one of the things that we looked at was, actually next slide as well, sorry. So when we looked at all this, how do we get this, deployed? And, we built all of terragraph as a V6 only network. The all of the traffic transiting over it is v6 only, but we realized that, you know, we would have to deploy v4. And so we decided to leverage L2 tunneling and SRv6 and VXLAN and NAT64 and all of these transition technologies to allow us to basically build a v6 only network like we had done in our data centers, but deploy it in terms of an access network. And so this allows carriers and operators and ISPs to basically deploy a network, greenfield, v6 only, still deliver v4, talk to the internet over v4. But the funny thing is that, you know, because it was v6 only, it's caused a little bit of a barrier of adoption because there's so many carriers out there that have no familiarity with v6. They don't see v6 as, like, you know, something that's pressing, but it actually is, because as we can't continue to operate the internet in a world where v4 is still king. You know, this is something that, you know, our hope is that as the internet continues to grow, v6 will outpace the growth of v4, so that we can return the internet back to what it was originally destined for, which was end-to-end communication of, you know, devices on the internet. We don't actually have that today with all of these NATs and things like that. So next slide, please. So I'll wrap
and that
up.
will be the conclusion. Please.
You want me to end here or continue with this?
Oh, just go through your conclusion.
So, like, you know, in conclusion, as everyone else has said, you know, the v4 exhaustion is real. You know, we see significant, you know, barriers to adoption, you know, in terms of like continuing to acquire v4 space so that people can continue to deliver services. For us, you know, the more traffic that comes over v6, you know, the better. I think this will hold true for most, you know, content providers that are dual stacked. You know, if a carrier deploys any sort of v6, either dual stack or single stack today, the majority of their traffic will, from customers that are utilizing, you know, v6, will transit over v6. You know, the you know, when you look at Facebook and Google and LinkedIn and Wikipedia and all of the, you know, top things that people use on the internet, they're all dual stack today. You know, and it's our hope that, you know, we can also see people deploying terragraph, which is something that, you know, we feel that can help, you know, improve connectivity to the unconnected world. And, you know, it's, you know, we just see barriers to adoption in terms of like getting licensing for 60 gigahertz in certain countries, you know, in the EU and around the world. But we have future-proof terragraphs so that it can be deployed in the next generation networks. So with that, I'll take questions later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you to have highlighted the technical benefits of v6 and not only the solution to the scarcity of IPv4. I think this is also a very nice approach, and to have reminded us also that the leapfrogging is still existing, except which is the example of India. I will now give the floor to Constance Berger. She's an information technology specialist at the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. And that's very interesting to have the government point of view on that IPv6 transition, and especially the point of view, but the lesson learned from IPv6 deployment in the administration. So Constance is working on IT and related policy since 2001. So she has a long experience on that, and I'll give her the floor right now. Just one thing, we already received some questions in the chat. We note the questions, and of course, we will deal with the question on the second part of the roundtable, or any panelist that reads the question, if he or she thinks that it's in his presentation the opportunity to answer, can feel free to answer it, of course. So, Constance, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope my voice is clear. And thank you for the opportunity to speak in this round. I introduce myself short. My name is Constance Berger. I work for the public administration since 2001. I studied as a computer scientist, and I work in the ministry in the moment on the main theme, the IPv6 deployment. I know a lot of people in the round. Marco, hi, and Sami, hi. It's nice to meet you again. And before we start, let me mention I'm not satisfied with the IPv6 deployment status, and I wish it will go on faster. And from my perspective, the IPv6 deployment is an infrastructure theme, and all these infrastructure themes are not visible on the political level. That's a big problem for us. So let's start. IPv6 is more than a technical issue in the public administration of Germany. Next slide, please. We have a legal and a political mandate. First of all, public administration has to provide IT services for everyone, everywhere, without discrimination. And we have to guarantee communication. Digitization needs more services and more devices. And I have to be honest, in the moment, we still use internal and public v4 addresses. We have to overcome this situation, and these handcraft nut things. We have to enable the connection to the internet, the end-to-end communication. The RFC 1918 limits the amount of internal IPv4 addresses, and this reason is for this reason we took over the conclusion IPv6 is mandatory for the public administration of Germany. Next slide, please. Our strategy. Since years, we are going to run a local internet registry, including organizational structure. We ordered a /23 IPv6 address space and a corresponding address plan. We handed over to the RIPE NCC, and we have still IPv4 address blocks left. We run a public administration information network based soon on IPv6, and we launched a master plan 2020 for the federal public administration itself. We produced a lot of papers. We have our own v6 profile for the public administration to run on, to get the ping over the wire, because we learned v6 is not v6. We have migration plans. We have workshop modules. If you are interested in, don't hesitate to contact me. We have these papers also available in English. Next slide, please. The short overview about our location, over our LAR, our DE government. We run this local internet registry. In the main part, we have the strategic part in the Federal Ministry of the Interior, and the operative part of the LAR is running in the Federal Agency for Safety and Digital Radio. We want to guarantee with this structure transparency, and rules as a precondition for security, DNS, and routing. For instance, you can run DNSSEC, IPsec just on the structured base. We also have to guarantee with this structure the federal independency of municipalities and federal states. Our LAR is working analog the RIPE-NCC, completed by a few German specifics. Next slide, please. The need of IPv6 and its implications. In contrast to v4, v6 forces to take a look at all OSI layers and overarching architectures. This requires new forms of communication and collaboration. Multi-stakeholder-based decisions are necessary, and we have to change this. For instance, mostly in the public administrations, on the political level, we have to go away from this hierarchical system. We need decisions faster and more technical. You can see on the graphic our IPv6 migration direction. You see the layers we have to in focus, but there's much more. There are contracts, procurement, testings, trainings. All these we have to realize. Next slide, please. IPv6 is more than a technical issue. Marco figured it out, and Paul also mentioned these things. It's not only the deployment of IPv6, and it's not only to bring in a new protocol. IPv6 forces us to think beyond our organization processes, national, international, EU-wide. We have to engage within the open multi-stakeholder groups, developing internet standards and policies. Today, technical functions and code are implementing conventions and values of societies. That's a very important point. IPv6 leads to new fields of action in the standardization of IT networks for regulators and administration and politics. V6 is mandatory. V6 is infrastructure. Infrastructure development is politics, and so V6 is politics. That's a very important message. Next slide, please. So I have on this slide an extract of policy and standard bodies. I think many of you know these bodies and are engaged in these, but I can see a lack of cooperation and collaboration in these bodies. We have to be engaged in these bodies to make sure that we can go forward, and therefore I have a wish in this round. Let's work together and let's develop an open, sustainable internet based on European values. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Constance, and thank you to have brought this point of view, and also to have added to the technical, the organizational, the economical nature of IPv6, of course, the political nature of IPv6. I will give the floor to our last panelist, Matthew Ford, who is Technology Program Manager at Internet Society, ISOC. Matthew has been researching IPv6 deployment and monitoring IPv6 adoption over 20 years. So when we are talking about the transition and maybe the evolution versus the revolution, we see that it's not at all a revolution, because we are studying it for some of us for more than 20 years. So it's about time to maybe to accelerate a little bit now, but gives a very nice idea of the knowledge of IPv6 by Matt. I give you the floor, Matthew, and then after we will start the debate and interaction between panelists and participants to this roundtable. Matt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining this very interesting workshop. I'm going to try and talk a bit about national approaches to fostering IPv6 deployment that seem to have borne fruit, in the hope that others might learn some lessons here. So if I could have the next slide, please. My first few slides will seem quite familiar by now. The global sort of picture of IPv6 deployment is quite a diverse one. India has already been identified as the standout #1 source of IPv6 traffic globally. And as Paul mentioned, that's more or less exclusively down to a single operator who built a greenfield network and decided that from day one that would be IPv6 only. So that's that's an opportunity for people deploying greenfield networks, not all networks obviously, but Reliance Jio really setting the standard there. And it's a similar approach that other operators have taken where they have the opportunity, like Sky Italia is a recent example in Europe, where they have also chosen to go down that route. Next slide, please. So looking at Europe, again, a similar picture, very diverse. Interestingly, some of the countries in Europe with the most IPv6 deployment are the countries in the world with the most IPv6 deployment, India accepted. And so whilst the landscape is fractured and diverse here, it is also in some respects a leader. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just highlight some of the, the sort of the top and the bottom of the diversity here. And I think this also shows that it's nothing to do really with Western Europe or Eastern Europe, or relatively wealthy or relatively less wealthy countries. The diversity is very hard to pin down to one single factor. Next slide, please. But what I will try and do is just through a couple of case studies highlight what seem to have been some of the factors that helped IPv6 deployment in these countries. So after India, Belgium is the #1 for IPv6 deployment in Europe and worldwide. And the key stimulus there really, I think, is the shortage of IPv4 addresses that has also stimulated a number of private businesses like Facebook and others to deploy IPv6. But interestingly also, limits on the ability to which carrier grade NAT or CGN could be deployed as a sort of workaround to the lack of IPv4 addresses meant that there was a very strong stimulus to deploy IPv6 as a means to address the growing network in Belgium. And there the IPv6 Council provided a forum for operators and engineers to share their experiences and their roadmaps for IPv6 deployment, and build a spirit of collaboration, really across otherwise competing businesses to get this job done. But even despite that, today mobile networks are still lagging here, which is in some ways surprising, because in other regions like North America, India and other countries, mobile networks are in the vanguard of IPv6 deployment. So again, it's hard to say, oh, well, that's understandable, because it's really not. But I think a lesson to draw here is that the collaborative competition between operators facing a similar challenge really helped, and the regulatory impetus gave them all the encouragement they needed. Next slide, please. So another country that I'm more familiar with is the United Kingdom. And again, here, IPv6 deployment has grown rapidly over the last 5 years. And the IPv6 Council here has also provided a similar, or played a similar role. They have a very diverse core team made up of representatives from ISPs, content providers, enterprises, and research and education networks. It's not a legally incorporated body. They're all volunteers relying on sponsorship from industry and hosts to deliver free public events and provide an online curated archive of valuable information and insight into how people are deploying IPv6, what challenges they're facing, and how they're overcoming those. And so now Sky in the UK have deployed dual stack to 5 million residential users. BT are also deploying dual stack. The mobile operator EE has deployed to millions of mobile users, again, IPv6 only, using 464 XLAT transition technology. The IPv6 Council in the UK mentioned that the security topics draw the biggest audience, and which is an interesting shift. So they're no longer talking about how do we do this, what are the obstacles, should we even do this anyway, what are the incentives? You know, they've moved sort of up the stack, if you will, of problems, and they're now more focused on dealing with the operational issues that arise when you're running a V6 network. Next slide, please. And then, as I've recently written quite extensively and spoken to some of the local regulators, I thought I'd mention Saudi Arabia, where there's been really dramatic growth in IPv6 deployment very recently, and they're now a leader in IPv6 adoption in the Middle East. Again, they're sort of driven by the regulator forming a task force made up of a mixture of service providers and key institutions. So again, this notion of a multi-stakeholder approach to tackling the problem of IPv6 deployment comes to the fore. They began by developing their strategy, focusing on core networks, the CCTLD, and building up training for the engineers in the region. And then they started publishing best practices and guidance for their public organizations and private organizations about how to best deploy IPv6. That got them so far, but by 2018, the awareness started to grow that Saudi was really falling behind in comparison to global adoption rates. And I personally find that quite gratifying as somebody who works on publishing global adoption rates and per country adoption rates. It's nice to know that that these sort of league tables do start to serve as a bit of a forcing function, at least to the extent that people care about how they look in comparison to their neighbors. And so they redoubled their efforts. Started holding more regular meetings and interestingly formalized regular key performance indicators. So really starting to regularly measure themselves and the progress of IPv6 deployment in Saudi Arabia against their neighbors and against the global average. And many times they mentioned the assistance of RIPE NCC with case studies from other operators and workshops, allowing them to discuss their challenges openly and learn from others, both within and beyond the region. And as you can see from the graph, the solutions that they identified early last year have had a dramatic impact, and it's now plain to see in adoption measurements that Saudi is a leader in the region. Next slide, please. So I think, in conclusion, there are a number of factors that seem to help. I mean, obviously, the shortage of IPv4 addresses is a strong incentive. And regulation that limits the extent to which operators can share IPv4 addresses across subscribers sort of compounds those shortages, which also furthers the incentive to deploy IPv6. But really, I think it's the formation of collaborative and that notion of competitive entities coming together to collaborate in an environment with good information sharing that comes across from these various case studies. The multi-stakeholder approach is important to involve not just the ISPs, but the content providers, the hosting providers, the RNE networks, and anyone really with an interest and willing to work on the problem. The information sharing, as I've mentioned, is key, publishing best current practices, helping people with things like addressing plans and dealing with the differences in terms of securing IPv6 networks versus IPv4 networks. Another thing that can help is vetted groups for information sharing, where between engineering teams, perhaps using a Chatham House rule. That allows people really to ask questions, about whether things they don't understand, problems they're running into, without those issues, you know, becoming front page news. Regular meetings using the tools available to observe the impact of their actions and the international shifts in traffic, and documenting and sharing their experiences and wins to encourage others. There's really no obstacle to IPv6 deployment today in terms of technical obstacles. It's really just down to political will, engineering will, and getting the job done. Thank you very much. Back to you, Pierre.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. We are almost right on time. Thank you to all panelists to have been able to share their views in such a close and very short moment. So thank you all. I would just like to, before opening the debate, to remind every participant that you can send your questions through the BEREC on the right side of your screen. We have received already some questions. We have received some questions before the opening of the panel, the days before. So the idea is to wrap up a little bit the questions and open the debate for the panel. And for those of you who had a telephone call or something else to do during the panel, or a power supply shortage or anything, you must know that there is a recording that will be available on the YouTube, BEREC's YouTube in the next days, as well as the possibility to access the presentations. So thank you, thanks to all the panelists for giving us, or giving BEREC their own intellectual property on that. You will have the opportunity to get access to this presentation on the BEREC website in the next days. So I'm turning back to the panel. We have received some questions. A lot of those questions has been answered in a way or another in the presentation you made. But I would like to come back to maybe three main pack of questions. There's a lot of questions about how to foster the IPv6 deployment at the national level. Some examples have been given, especially by Matthew just before the opening of the debate, but still questions about what are the most important barriers to remove? What are the most efficient incentives to give, or to let the people know? And what are the best kind of organizations at the national level to make sure that everyone is on board? On this first part of the questions, if you want to elaborate what you have presented already, or give some new informations, you have the floor, and if you agree, we'll take 15 minutes on this part, which is a main part of the questions that are asked by the participants. Who wants to raise its or her hand?
I can.
Marco.
Yeah, thanks. Now, I think, and then I think that was noticed from my colleagues' presentations. I think the key here is coordination. So when you ask, like, what's the best organization to do this, I would like to answer twofold. On one hand, the best organization to do IPv6 is you. You have to do it yourself. It's your network, it's your customers. This is about your future. And then we need to cooperate. And I think that's also important when you look at BEREC. as a regulator, maybe it isn't as much about regulation, but I think also the regulators can play an important role in coordinating, bringing all these people together and making sure that everybody moves in conjunction. Matt's shown a couple of great initiatives like IPv6 task forces where the industry organizes itself. But I think also from a regulatory perspective, promoting that kind of self-organization and helping these people work is a great initiative. And that's, for instance, also the case that we saw in Saudi Arabia, where the regulator did take the lead in coordinating and bringing everybody together.
No, sorry, I see. Thank you, Marco. I see Matthew and then Constance.
Yeah, just on the question of incentives, Paul mentioned the data that they shared many years ago about the performance improvements they were seeing. Apple have also recently shared similar data showing a 1.4x increase in connection setup time for IPv6 traffic. And it's not really that surprising. I mean, there are probably a number of different factors involved, but at the end of the day, if you're restricting the number of ports available to subscribers to share public addresses across multiple subscribers, essentially what you're doing is you're trading off the quality of their experience because you, as an operator, for whatever reason, haven't or aren't deploying IPv6. And so I think to some extent, if we can get that growing connection between IPv6 capable operators and quality, I think that will help incentivize subscribers to migrate to those operators, especially where there's a competitive environment, because ultimately those operators will be providing a more robust, more resilient, and a better long-term experience.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Constance?
Yes. First of all, in our environment, we need a political signal. IPv6 is mandatory, and then I think we need a plan, and I think we have that, and we have the preconditions, and we can start. But it's a long term, and it's a long way. We are so slow. We need resources, we need knowledge, and the visibility. It's that's the most the biggest problem to be seen, to be to make sure and to be aware what infrastructure is. That's the point, and I need also help to go forward, to be more visible with these topics. And I think we can do this together with the BEREC or with the member states or with the industry. I think we need each other to implement these infrastructures based on V6.
Thank you, Constance. So we had some nice contribution on how to organize. What are the main incentives? I will jump to another. It's a kind of subsection of these questions. There are a few questions about the legal and regulatory incentives, or the possible legal and regulatory incentive. We had heard mandatory. We have heard what is the role or could be the role of the regulators. So I listened to Marco, for instance, who said that regulators could facilitate and coordinate, which is nice, but it's regulators can also regulate. So is it something that is expected, useful, there are more specific questions, and I give you one from my friend Peter Krosch. Is the regulation 2015/2120 useful in assessing and/or encouraging V6 deployment for end user access? So this is a very specific question on a very specific regulation. If anyone wants to answer that one, that would be great. More globally, what kind of is there an obligation, a regulation that is needed, or the only facilitation or conviction approach is enough to help this transition? Marit.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you. So I think many of this was a bit discussed already in the presentations. As for the obligation, if I understand from, or the mandatory aspect, if I understand correctly from Constance, there was rather a legal obligation for the country to provide connectivity, etc., which was the impetus then to the political impetus then to accelerate the deployment. So it's very important. I mean, I don't think that from our perspective there is any need for a kind of obligatory regulatory approach. This is not necessarily the most effective way. And also, if we kind of reflect on the wider picture in the digital development where we are now in Europe, so we have new digital targets from the operator's perspective now, quite ambitious. Everybody should have very high capacity networks and 5G by the end of 2030. By 2030 rather, and so, you know, we don't want to have regulation that would somehow, you know, that might have consequences and spillovers to other things. So and force, let's say, operators to, for example, prioritize IPv6, which is already a priority, but potentially on the you know, on the back of something else that is arguably just as important. So I think, you know, hard regulation is a very heavy tool, and that would maybe go a bit, let's say, too far. But what I also mentioned already earlier is that there are many types of soft policy tools. So there is the kind of voluntary cooperation. I think all these task forces, etc., at the national level is extremely useful, and our members have been taking part in many of them, and best practice sharing. And then there's the kind of softer policy approaches whereby, you know, you can include recommendations for IPv6 as part of, I don't know, large national projects or other projects, so that, you know, you are then gradually actually, well, deploying IPv6 as you are deploying new infrastructures, new digital systems in any particular country or space. So this is, you know, from our side, this would be the preferred approach and the approach that also makes sense. And also we're not starting from nowhere. So there's also lots of progress that has already been done. So I think it's also important that we take this into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Marit. Does anyone in the room want to say strong law on that matter? Constance?
I absolutely agree. You can't regulate these topic in Germany because we will still have islands of IPv4, and I can't regulate in the federal system so much, and I don't want to do this because the innovation cycle is not part of my job. And I'm a strategy leader in this strategy, but not an operator. And from my perspective, we have to use also a multi-stakeholder issue. The people who provide infrastructure in the public administration are really self-confident and they know about their infrastructure. And we have together and we can support them. And there's the new role from my perspective, for the BEREC. BEREC can support, BEREC can engage, we can cooperate, and we can build up policies, and we can take part in the standards bodies, and we can aware these infrastructure development. So we can do a lot, but regulating, for instance, to set a time slot, implement or deploy IPv6 in 2 years, that's not necessary from my perspective. Thank
you. Matthew, and then I will come back to Klaus, because there are some questions on the role of BEREC to help the regulators having their role in the IPv6 transition. So first of all, Matthew.
Thanks, Pierre. I'll be brief. Yeah, I think regulation, it would be pretty hard. I mean, I was just looking, and the UK is the country I know best, and Ofcom's website isn't on IPv6, and none of the government services are available over IPv6. I'd love to see the UK government and the local regulatory authority here deploy their services over IPv6 before they started regulating for anyone else to. Having said that, I think it would be really encouraging for them to say publicly that they would set a goal of doing that within the next, say, 2 years, as a way to try and encourage other operators and other service providers and content providers in the UK and elsewhere to do likewise.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that. So, Klaus, there are some questions about the role of BEREC to help the European regulators raising their own awareness. We see that there is a shift sometimes between some parts of Europe and other parts of Europe in terms of deploying IPv6. What are your views on that?
Thanks, Pierre. First, I would like to start with what I said in the beginning. So, rarely the regulators have any formal mandate over IPv6. We have in Finland, we have quite a strong mandate for giving national regulations, but we also decided against regulating IPv6, and we chose to have a collaborative, let's say, approach to this. And to me, that's really the key, because we are not really seeing a massive regulations coming on. The NRAs don't have the mandate to do that mainly. And also, I mean, the BEREC doesn't really have a formal mandate of IPv6. We're not really writing guidelines for the NRAs or something they should really take into account more mandatory way. But basically, well, I really believe in collaboration, information sharing, and I think Matt mentioned that in Saudi Arabia they were following what the neighbors were doing, and I mean, it giving you a bit public pressure when your neighbors, when your competitors are doing it, but you are not. That actually worked pretty well in Finland, because then we got, let's say, a few major players into the business. I mean, then it's quite easy to ask also from the others why you're not doing it. And then we are really talking about the regulation, the Open Internet regulation. It gives end users a right to use and provide services. And I mean, as I mentioned, you would really need to have a public IP address to do so. There are certain applications, certain services that really requires a public IP address. And if you think, let's say, an operator having multiple end users, really many of them asking, well, I want to have a public IP address. Do they actually have enough of those if they are not really implementing IPv6? So yes, there's a regulation that gives also some motivation to do so. We want to be an enabler. We want that the end users can use and provide services, and that the internet can scale and also continue to work as an engine for innovation. Then regarding BEREC, well, I was planning to do a short presentation also as a closing remark, but well, we are really planning to have or discussing a potential work item for 22. We will, of course, first need to digest the contributions and the discussions of this workshop. Then we will internally discuss a potential work item. It could take a potentially foremost best practice report, setting a policy principles, including relevant experiences BEREC can draw on, as well as some common principles from across the different countries and NRAs regarding the transition to IPv6. It's definitely important for BEREC, and we are planning to continue to work with this topic. But as I mentioned, it's not a very much mandatory task for the NRAs or for BEREC. So I think really this kind of the collaboration and the information sharing is something we should use. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Klaus. On that part of regulation, legal constraints, we have had a kind of on one side consensus that the big stick may not be the best tool, but in the middle of the incentives, that can be some little pressure put on all the actors to help this deployment accelerate a little bit. I will just come back to one question that has been sent, and maybe that will be a way to end this part on regulation or legal incentive. There is a question and some question that has been sent before that are focusing on end user. And Klaus has talked about it with the need sometimes to have a public address. The question is, what is a full internet access for an EU citizen? The regulators could demand IPv6 functionality mandatory for every offered connection contract, and at least a /56 for everyone. But why are ITNO and GSMA members preventing their mobile customers to offer digital services over their IPv6 connection? Okay, there is a demand from some end users say, why cannot I have an IPv6? And why the regulator is not imposing the availability of IPv6 to the end users. Does anyone wants to elaborate on it? But this is not compulsory to elaborate on it, of course.
Yeah, I can just, you mentioned specifically ITNO and GSMA here. So I must admit that from our side, of course, we are a trade association based in Brussels, and IPv6 is a heavily technical issue, of course. And as you already saw from the general data as well, there are great divergences between European countries, not just operators, but between different European countries. And the reasons for the, let's say, divergent stages or stages of development are a bit unclear. So whereas I'm sure this is a valid question and it comes from somewhere, but it's not quite clear. I don't have a generic answer to this question at this moment in time, and I'm not sure that there will be a generic answer to this question because I'm not sure it's a general problem. So so yeah, certainly something that we can revisit, but I'm not able to address this right now.
Thank you very much, Mary, to have answered it first, and secondly, I'm just the reader, so I'm just conveying questions. I'll try to be as neutral as I can on that, even if when it comes to regulation usefulness, we French have a slightly different idea from the consensus that we hear here. And that may be a reason why the numbers of IPv6 in France are not so bad. But I'm not a panelist. I'm just someone who try to read the questions and give the floor to every panelist. Okay, so we have talked about that. And if you want to elaborate more on the regulatory aspect, feel free to do it. There was another set of questions sent. Okay. Yeah, there was another set of questions sent. And please, when you write questions, don't write questions with IPv6 address in the middle of it, because it's totally impossible to read. Thank you. Another set of questions, and I know that it has been discussed within the panel presentation yet, but I think it's nice to come back to that, is, okay, when you say everyone has to translate, to go to IPv6, and Matthew said and others said, there is no problem. Really? Is there any? There is no problem. Technically, there is no problem. What are the problems? A lot of questions are about that. Okay, what problems have been identified by people who have done it? In security, in the cohabitation of IPv6 and IPv4, in rewriting all your IP allocation space because you have a new IP, in trying to get materials and products that are compatible with IPv6. Is there any problem? Is everything compatible IPv6? Do I have to choose several manufacturers out of others? All these questions are asked somewhere. I don't have, I can talk about domain names more than IPv6. So I don't have any answer, but I'm very sure that in the panel, some of you have answered. So I'll give you the floor. Okay, Matthew, then Marco.
Well, I did say that there isn't any technical obstacle. I think the fact that there are, national scale, multi-million subscriber IPv6 networks using a whole variety of different technologies, and the fact that there are fixed networks, mobile networks running IPv6 only in some cases, illustrates that there's no obstacle technically to doing this. There may be obstacles in terms of if people have, existing deployments, then inevitably you have to go through a process of assessing what support your existing hardware has, what support your existing software has, and where that needs to change. It may need to change, and that's not always going to be without cost. But those aren't technical obstacles. So I think it's a case of building the business case, and to my mind, the business case is motivated in a large part by having a future-proof network, having a network that can grow, having a network that is reliable, and having a network that's easier to manage. Because the end game here is to get rid of IPv4 altogether, because nobody really wants to be running a dual stack network if they can avoid it. And I think that's why we're seeing the greenfield deployments taking the opportunity to deploy IPv6 only, because it's easier to manage. And so I think the incentives are there. The technical obstacles can be removed if they exist because of legacy equipment, and that's just part of the process of deploying IPv6. But I'm not an operator, so it's easy. This is just talk.
No, yeah, of course. Thank you to remind us that when you say that there is no technical obstacle, I mean, say that, okay, this is proven that it works at a large scale with different kind of devices, etc. and that's a very very important thing. I mean, this is not a R&D product that we have to do a proof of concept before deploying it. It's already up and running, and still it can be a challenge for some organization to deploy it, but it works. Marco.
Yeah, I heard you ask, like, yeah, what sort of do we have to need to translate? Yes, we probably have, but I think we should also recognize that that is designed as a temporary situation. So right now you have the choice: do you translate IPv4 into IPv4, or do you translate IPv6 into IPv4 where you need it? And that sort of the point that Matt just raised is you have to look to the future, and the future is IPv6. So if you deploy it in a way that the more you get IPv6, the easier it is. And back to the earlier point is also like, yeah, and where do you intervene? If you want to intervene, how do you intervene? For instance, you also see that a bit in the Commission strategy now that also mentions sunsetting IPv4. We shouldn't just only look into like, yeah, we need to deploy IPv6, yes, but we need to deploy IPv6 because we want to get rid of this constrained space that is IPv4. And that's where the real pain is. And I think we should also very much make that pain more visible. It is the cost of running nets. It is the cost of translating, as Matthew and Paul said. It is slow. IPv4 internet is slowing down compared to IPv6. And unfortunately, nobody from law enforcement here, but on a daily basis, they struggle with trying to find attribution when addresses are shared amongst thousands and thousands of users. So we do know there are pain points here. And in that sense, yes, for now, accept that we live in a world that is a mixed topology, but aim for the long goal, and that's have IPv6. So translating something back to IPv4 where you need it, in my opinion, is a more feasible solution than keep sticking into layers and layers of IPv4 translation. That's my view.
Thank you very much, Marco. And I see that Paul has raised his hand, and I apologize because maybe it's raised for a long time, but as it is gray on gray, I was not very sure to see it. So Paul, you have the floor.
I'll reiterate what Matthew said, that there's really no technical barrier to v6 anymore. A lot of the hard work has been done for everybody. You know, I think the thing that's maybe not spoken about here is you will probably have lower costs associated with your network when you deploy v6. Because when you look at what your customers, your end users are actually connecting to on the internet, the majority of their traffic is going to dual stacked endpoints. And that traffic will not have to go through any translation layers. So your CGN costs go down. And this is seen, you know, via the first mover and shaker in this. It was T-Mobile in the United States. They went NAT 6.4, 464 XLAT, you know, day one, and saw massive reductions in costs because they don't have to, you know, utilize the CGN space. I mean, so much so if there's a bug on Facebook, you know, they'll ping us because, you know, if they see an increase in v4 connectivity, or they ask us, when are we going to migrate some traffic that is still on v4 over to v6? These sort of things, you know, are really important because, you know, people view v6 as a cost because it requires them to, you know, gain expertise, potentially buy some newer hardware. But that cost is far cheaper than, you know, the savings you will have in being able to scale your business and scale your infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to read out the question from Joey Nail that covers some of the comments that has been just made. Joey says, we understand the prevalence of dual stack applications in core networks. How much do the presenter think that IPv6 rollout is being delayed or impacted by the lack of support for native IPv6 in the hardware switch routers or in the network operating system. Now, I would add that it's another way to come back to regulation in a way. But is this evolution versus revolution thing? Is delaying anything? Is the dual stack delaying the IPv6 transition? Anyone wants to come back to that?
I can take a step. I don't think dual stack was by design. That's not meant to delay. And as far as hardware software support has been going, I know there are probably still nodes in the network that don't do IPv6, but be reminded, this was standardized in 1995. We are looking at a 20-year-old technology. Mobile networks have gone through 4 generations now. It's hard to believe that you have a mobile network on 4G that doesn't do IPv6. You might need to push a few buttons, but it should be there. And again, to Paul, if you are seeing it the way you should see it as a long-term investment, it's entirely feasible, and you might have to replace a few boxes, but I think that's part of that investment cycle. That's your long-term horizon. But I don't operate the network. Disclaimer.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco, for that. Marit.
Yes, I feel like I'm in the middle of a discussion with 3 engineers, and I'm trying to cope with these rather technical questions. But yeah, I mean, on the barriers, I mean, I think, and I said before that, of course, operators have mainly deployed the dual stack, as I said in my presentation. And I think it's a balanced approach. So as Marco was saying, there are still elements that are not supporting IPv6. So, and if you think about operators' business from a very kind of a common sense point of view, the core business is to provide connectivity to end customers. And this is, you know, the way operators exist. So to do anything to abrupt or risky to disturb that, of course, it's out of the question, because you cannot certainly, you know, endanger your business. So if there are any question marks as to any bit of equipment or part of the network or IPv4, you know, enabled server or security, performance, other things, these are all key things. And so for that reason, of course, this dual stack serves a role in the evolution. And as I said, and many others said as well, IPv6 is a long-term effort. And I think that, you know, and we discussed this also a bit internally, so large organizations, they need an actual audit or kind of a mapping, milestone map, you know, over several years on how do you integrate an organization that, you know, has networks in 1, 2, 3, I don't know, 10 countries, sometimes outside Europe and other continents. So how do you actually go about migrating all of that? So I think we need to relativize a bit as well. And it's also interesting, I mean, it would be interesting to see the kind of the, you know, the long term, the curve, you know, we year on year, I mean, we're still migrating more and more, and maybe it is not even across the countries, and maybe it is not that quick. But if the curve is consistently positive, I think that is still rather reassuring. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marit. And this is not only an engineer discussion, even if there is this technical aspect of it, but thank you for that contribution. We'll go on because we still have 5 minutes before the closing. Coming back to another set of questions that has been asked, and they are all about exemplarity. Is there an incentive in the idea that administrations, governments are the first to switch to IPv6? Now, this is the first part of the question. So, what do you think about exemplarity, in a way? And exemplarity is switching to IPv6 or deploying IPv6 and show to the other, hey, look at me, I do it and it's going well, before regulating people. The other tool that is mentioned in the question is, what do you think about having concrete incentive, I mean money, that would be in a way or another included in recovery plan, ICT recovery plan post-COVID-19, or new obligation linked with public tender asking to have IPv6 connectivity. So you see, this set of questions is about, first, exemplarity of the government, the regulators, etc. Second, the tools that the governments or the executive have to give real incentive to the transition in terms of tenders or even recovery plans. Anyone wants to comment on that? That will be easy to ask Constance to comment first, of course.
So first, exemplarities. We have our tax agency is fully IPv6 from the core to the edge. So I'm really proud of it, and it's called Elster. And a friend of mine is the network engineer, and he did that. And so that's a very good explanation for this. It's very good to learn. There is someone who's going forward, and we have this framework, and we can use his experiences, and we have some more data centers. They are also V6 from core to edge, and some more examples. Yes. From my perspective, I have to coordinate all these examples. I have to bring them together to generate some similar documents that I can help the people to engage to deploy IPv6. In the public administration, it's not the question of money. I think it's the question of resources, of people who are engaged, who have the knowledge, who have who are curious to do this, and are brave to do this, and to make the step forward. Yeah. So the second part, once more, Pierre. I forgot the second part.
The second part was about the investment, in a way, the ICT recovery plan, the tenders.
We thought about these topics, but Marco and Paul mentioned a lot of these themes. There's an innovation cycle, and what is the consequence? My legal task is to guarantee communication. This is my job, to do this for the whole public administration, for the government. This is my job, and I have to do all that. I have to guarantee communication for the next years, sustainable for the next 20 years, for the next 50 years. And there's no choice for me. I have to enable IPv6, and this is my aim. Yes, it's too slow without dual stack. Way forward, V6 only in all governmental infrastructures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constance. No input from the industry asking for money in the ICT recovery plan? Okay. Marit.
Yes, maybe just to comment first on the exemplary approach. So I think leading by example is a very, very strong concept in general. And I certainly think that if any kind of policy measures, new policy measures were being introduced by either national governments or at the EU level for that matter, you know, there would be certainly more credibility if then these institutions, as Matt was saying about the UK before, would before that at least announce a plan to migrate their own infrastructures. You know, we certainly understand that it doesn't happen overnight, so we don't, you know, there's no need maybe for 100% compliance, but at least the intent, to show that the intent is there and that the whole, let's say, stakeholder community is moving ahead. On the recovery fund, well, I mean, we are already very pleased to have seen that a lot of money is going into digital development in general, and of course the plans have been developed at national level. I think it would be a bit questionable to see what kind of activities would be done with public money in this respect. I mean, giving the money to operators to deploy IPv6, I think you know, IPv6 migration is part of the business plans, etc. So I'm not sure that this would be necessarily the best way to go. Maybe taking money to the government to do some educational campaigns and you know, some plans for resilience and future-proofing the networks as part of a kind of bigger picture. That could be perhaps something to consider. But yeah, so. And yeah, so not quite sure about the recovery funds for this very specific purpose. Thanks.
Okay, I saw that Marco wanted to comment on that, and then after we will go to the conclusion of this panel.
Yeah, Marit already said a lot, and I don't think that you necessarily need to throw money at IPv6 deployment. But yeah, again, if you now look at sort of recovery funds and people pushing billions, maybe trillions in infrastructure projects that will have an horizon for 20, 30 years. Yeah, you need IPv6 there. And again, as a reminder, doing IPv6 doesn't necessarily exclude IPv4. I think realistically for now you still have to aim IPv6, especially from a government perspective, not to exclude anybody. But and I agree with Constance, the end goal is IPv6 only. What I've noticed here, and I do recognize, for instance, in the US market as well, you do see that government spending can have an impact because there is a lot of money being spent on ICT projects. And if you say this money must be spent including IPv6, that could be a helpful initiative. Where I see a lot of these incentives fail, and probably also in Germany the case, is that the people that are actually out to buy it and technically have a mandate to ask for IPv6 are not aware enough of the problem. It's too quick for the purchasers, especially on the government side, to step over the IPv6 requirement because they don't really get what it's good for. So outside of training the engineers, I think we should also really focus on training our purchasers and make sure that they understand what they are asking for, and they understand that what they're asking for is about future-proofing the network. And I think that's worth a bit of investment also from the public sector side. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Marco. Before we conclude, and we're going to conclude very quickly, I would like to ask every panelist if he or she wants to add something that you think should have been said. No, of course, some other things could have been said, but is there, I mean, a message that you just really wanted to share and didn't have the opportunity to share today for the conclusion? No, I see now. So I'm going to give back the floor to Klaus. Just before that, I just want to thank you all the participants, for your questions and your attention. Of course, all the panelists for the very interesting, exciting ideas and facts that you've shared with us. I would like also to thank very much Véronique May and Jonathan Edward Duggan for having organized and made sure that we had the best panelists and the best organization possible for this panel. So thank you very much for your work and your dedication to this panel. I would like also to thank Sami Swisi, my friend from ARCEP, who I would have loved him to explain how regulation is very, very well accepted in IPv6 in France, but he would have the occasion to say it in another panel. And for the great collaboration, because this is collaboration, this is not obligation, that we have AFNIC with ARCEP on numerous matters, and especially on IPv6. And thanking also Lucien Castex, who's working on AFNIC as the representative for public affairs, who gave me this opportunity to work with BEREC on this very interesting panel. With that, I give you the conclusion words, Klaus, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Pierre, for moderating this discussion. I would also like to thank all of our speakers and all of you participating in the discussion, giving the questions and comments. You made this excellent and very interactive event to happen. We hope that you found this event interesting and useful. I think at least in BEREC Open Internet Working Group we did. BEREC will continue to encourage and monitor rollout of this future-proof protocol. Thank you all. The event is now closed. We wish you all a nice afternoon.